ただ最近思うのは、体なんて人間にとって心の入れ物でしかないのなら、私には意味のないものだなって、いつも心で飛んでるんです。
Excluding the idle roll cutscene and input prompts, Ace Combat 3's UI is almost absolutely diegetic. It starts as you open the box. The disc seems to look like an archive of software. Although you're on a PlayStation 1, the entire user experience is framed from within a type of virtual reality computer. You don't start a new game, you select a new account. You don't load a save, you download through that account. You don't continue, it's reopening. It's not a glossary, you search the teletext. When you create this account, you're allowed to enter a name using a QWERTY input, something that wasn't a standard for another 2 generations of game consoles. Zelda, Spider-Man, Persona, Tony Hawk, Symphony of the Night, Chrono Cross, Final Fantasy, and Ace's sister series Ridge Racer didn't do this. In Dot Hack and Metal Gear Solid 2, you log into computers that bizarrely use ABCDE layout. It's just easier to code for a number of reasons, and the offset rows means QWERTY doesn't gel well with the D-pad's cardinal input. For a Japanese game from 1999 to have this beautifully rendered QWERTY input for a screen you'll probably only look at once is so unusual, I'd say it's damn well worthy of note. Following on from this, the game then asks you to adjust your settings to further sell the digital landscape that you're in, and probably to validate the effort that went into that interface. The primary concession of the game's presentation is that we're viewing it through a fictional OS, Data Swallow, which in retrospect is a brilliant pun to Ace Combat being a flight sim. It uses the eponymous Electrosphere, this game's concept of an internet, as an information highway. The game asserts we're hooked into Data Swallow through a Neurolink, effectively a brain-to-computer interface. The menu soundscape sells this, save the confirm button, which rather than producing a synthetic bleep sounds closer to someone pecking an enter key. This sleek UI may remind you of other games surrounding the era, such as Wipeout and some of the less street aspects of Jet Set Radio. There's a storied history to this aesthetic that starts in 80s Sheffield of all places, by a company called the Designers Republic. This company actually did work on Wipeout. It's based on Russian constructivism and comes from a background of postmodernist anti-corporate parody. It embodies a fiction of dystopian capitalism, with its sense of bright uniformity and subdued dark undertones. It predates how many corporate logos today have honed themselves down to basic shapes like a pop art breed of retro-futurism. The futuristic vibe it gives off means that it could be otherwise described as a look into tomorrow, and its origin in 80s England explains the inherent Japanophobia nested within it, given Japan's exponentially growing economic power. Just look at Blade Runner if you want a good example of the sentiment of the time. The Western world was scared of its own radioactive monster. Without a standing army, Japan's post-war economy boomed. All the technological advancement became commercial, and we were kneeling to Japanese engineering and production. That is, until the 90s. Japan's economy has been failing, and its manufacturing industry has been bought out by foreign interests. What they originally called the Lost Decade has had a profoundly somber influence on the media they produced. This game is a good example. A Japanese dev team is using this art style in 1999. The anti-corporate undertones seem to suggest a disgust at what Japan's power once was. What I want to impress upon you is that this sleek, curved, colourful and somewhat intangible aesthetic doesn't seem so alien to us now as it once was. This aesthetic bleeds through every asset of this game's UI, and that probably tells you more than you need to know about the world of Ace Combat 3 in 2040. The game is unapologetic in how it depicts the exact moment of time where everyone realises governance is lost to capital. Once you create a new profile, the game opens on what can only really be described as a torrent of channels through the Electrosphere, like we're being born into it. The news plays up the rising tension between the 2 major corporations within UPEO, which is hilariously juxtaposed between saccharine advertisements for those very companies. This is because 2 of the 3 major networks are owned by these 2 conglomerates, and both shamelessly spin stories to favour their particular corporation. Modern journalism, in other words. General Resource Limited came about from a string of massive corporate mergers, creating an insane excess of capital that rivals several governments at once. In fact, its international stakes means that it supplanted national government law. Almost all land is now owned by corporations like General Resource. NEUCOM has a similar monopoly. It started life as a branch of General Resource, focused on space exploration, but eventually splintered off into its own conglomeration, developing the Electrosphere, nanotechnology, and neurocomputing, the Neurolink I mentioned earlier. The 2 Zaibatsu share a border, and in contrast to the benevolence their ads purport, the current hot news is one of 5-year-long tensions between the 2 Zaibatsu coming to a head. They're arguing over a piece of land called Faith Park, and negotiations seem doomed. Our 3rd news channel is government-run, and therefore completely unbiased. Their stance is more observational, foretelling the inevitable conflict between the two sides, reporting the tactical posturing of each company's armed forces to match the rhetorical posturing we've seen. Interesting as it is, this presentation of pseudo-television is where Ace Combat got its stylistic presentation as documentaries. Ace 04, 5, and 0 presented themselves as such holistically, before 6 and 7 dropped the pretense of retrospect and became heavily procedural narrations. After being submerged in the deluge of media, the telly's interrupted by some voice messages and commands from our superiors. Somehow, even these get interrupted by breaking news bulletins that General Resource and NEUCOM have now engaged in open hostilities after the latter ordered an attack. General Resource is towing the line with defensive encampments and not directly retaliating. This is our excuse to actually get to play the game. The reason this attack warrants our arrival is that we work in the Special Armed Response Force under the United Peace Enforcement Organization of the Neo-United Nations. So we're SARF, part of UPEO, a subsidiary of the NUN. More simply, we're this world's combined government's dire attempt at retaining a monopoly of force, and therefore relevance on the world stage. In news and internal staff debates over voice messages, there's an interesting political pressure put on our UPEO faction. As peacekeepers, we need to buffet our military to fend off attacks on others' behalf, but there's naturally bad optics associated with increasing militarization in the name of peace. Characters from within your squad are growing more concerned that their organization is being called a paper tiger. Even if you are successful, there's an argument you're limiting the tactical damage each side can do to one another, in turn prolonging tensions and encouraging mistakes and more non-tactical damage. So we're attacking NEUCOM bombers from behind on the first mission, as always. The slow-moving targets are slow-moving targets, and their awkward alignment forces you to get used to the acceleration and maneuverability controls, which are fully customizable. The enemy reinforcements at the end of mission dare you to turn and intercept them, so that the designers can be confident that the player can roll, pull up, and change their course. Following on from this, there's a bombing mission. Short of actual bombs, it's mostly an exercise to see if the player can keep from ditching their plane on the floor. Contact with the ground is death, which should be avoided. You've probably heard me say this before because they do the same covert tutorial every game, but what isn't as routine is that we now have a far less tacit tutorial during Mission 3, Enter Dision. We have to fly with General Resource's Ace in a joint exercise team build. This Ace's call sign is Dision, and this is because his honest-to-God name is Abyssal Dision.
いつの日か誰もが肉体の限界を感じるだろう。それは悪いことではない。ただ、その限界を超える精神力を持つ者はそれを口にする必要がないだけなんだ。
His name literally translates to abysmal saying in Toad language. Dision is canonically French. The following mission is a following mission. It acts to tutorialize the following mechanic: joining, which isn't really a mechanic so much as it is a state. This joining state tutorial stealthily gives you a secondary gameplay tutorial as well as hiding two integral narrative purposes. Joining, in capital letters, require you be in proximity of the target plane, chasing them being the best method of this, which is where the first narrative purpose comes in. Narratively, the scenario strongly emphasizes Dision's ace skills and character by making you shadow his relentless stunts. His skill and expertise are hard to follow, even for veteran players. He'll even make a comment about it if you don't follow him for long enough. Gameplay-wise, yes, we tutorialize the following mechanic, joining, but in displaying what Dision can do, and having the player mimic that, it will inform you via hands-on play what's possible with Ace Combat's control scheme. In my Ace Combat 0 video, I'd previously suggested the typical lack of traditional tutorials in Ace games was a motion sickness and comfort issue. I suspect this was the game where they learned that from. It's like tailgating a lost wasp. If even I'm losing track of which way is up and down, I'm going to assume more sensitive players might suffer in this section. The second narrative reason is that, like any good book, the first chapter should establish the motif of the story. After we've chased Dision to hell and back, there's a bit of target practice to show that targets without heat signatures can't be locked onto but still shot down. Then some NEUCOM enemies intercept the training exercise and put that to the test. Now that I think about it, it also introduces mission updates, a bit more formally than last mission. These had been a part of Ace Combat 2 but were sparingly used, less so to surprise the player. Missions threw curveballs at times toward the end, but it was a fun arcade game first and foremost. A clear and understandable goal is something built in. Ace Combat 3 instead uses mission updates to generate a betrayal of expectation or complication. These serve gameplay purposes still, but the reason it's relied upon and tutorialized here is because mission updates will serve primarily narrative purposes. The mission designer already knows what will happen, it's the player whom does it. Therefore, the designer can surprise the player by changing the assumed scenario and creating a situational journey. Being thwarted, NEUCOM now stop just pestering and decide to throw out a major naval attack on General Resource's Megafloat, a location also featured in Ace Combat 4's 2-player mode. Once again, we have to keep the peace, and as UPEO's star race is down, the player is allowed to take the stage fighting alongside Generals Dision. Only after this mission will a ceasefire be announced, which implies that whilst we're in the air fighting, those talks are ongoing. NEUCOM has tried their luck with this fleet attack, only wanting a ceasefire to prevent retaliation, but tit for tat, a mission update requests that we destroy all airborne targets too, implying General Resource refuses to acquiesce to the ceasefire until they've used our peace enforcement to put a dent in NEUCOM's forces. Both corporations are using us to put wind behind their war sails. We're being manipulated. Dision himself sees through this, recognizes our skill as a pilot, and beckons us to join him. This is a real, binary choice, and it's contextualized to us through the following mechanic. Joining. Ace Combat 3 has 5 entirely different endings in total, and this is how it announces its major branching paths. You have to choose to follow or not, and there's usually no pausing to think it over. It's a decision you make with the same control scheme as the rest of the game, making it a holistically diegetic experience. These decisions are often well weighted, and what you pick will likely come down to a preference of key characters for each faction, or an exploration of previously unseen routes as interest in the larger narrative grows. For now, Dision himself seems like a bit of a self-righteous nutjob, but at the same time, UPEO doesn't feel much different, and the sides of this war so far have painted his employers, General Resource, in a light veil of victimhood. But honestly, I just don't trust Dision because his skin color is darker than his hair color. I break off his tail and we remain in UPEO. Working with us at UPEO, we have a few characters. At the head of it, Delegate Gabriel W. Clarkson, a level-headed pacifist who reinvigorated UPEO under the Neo-United Nations. Your co-workers view his decisions as just and reasonable, despite what the detractors say. Under him is Commander Gilbert Park. This is a Japanese game from the 90s and he's got a Korean last name. As a matter of course, this means he has extremely lofty career ambitions and favors strengthening UPEO's military. With our squadron is Eric. He does a whole lot of complaining and he's mostly here to express distaste for the muddy realities of this war as it delves to deeper and darker places. Fiona too is her own character, who's only worth talking about much later in this video. General have used the ceasefire agreement to reset the state of play and launched an attack on NEUCOM. Officially, our mission is interception, and it puts great emphasis on this to exaggerate that the mission depends almost entirely on a technicality, that if GR and NEUCOM's forces don't directly meet, then the ceasefire won't have been breached, despite every attempt by either side to breach it. And post-mission, Fiona and Eric chatter about the nature of their peacekeeping at this point, since it does feel like each side is in turn using a peacekeeper's firepower to exhaust one another and maintain battle lines. The density of this story is kind of outstanding for their first attempt at creating a story around a plain combat game engine. In the earlier missions, there's a surface layer context to your actions, derived from a secondary pessimistic political layer, and distinct from that are the characters that you come to know, some of them better realized than others admittedly. And later on, we'll learn that there's depth beyond even that as we follow individual character motivations to their logical conclusions. This multi-tiered presentation provides contrasting motives for the player as they approach choices, whether they'll diverge from the path they're on. The initial decision as to whether or not you follow Dision defaults to you being behind him, and whilst that's a suggestion to the player, there may also be some reverse psychology at play. The final, star member of UPEO is Rena. For the past few missions she's been absent, but the next couple are going to focus on her to elicit intrigue and concern. But truth be told, this entire path of Ace Combat 3 could be summarized with the question, who is Rena? Born with a rare condition that leaves her body defenseless against the sun's rays, in this game called Silverstone disease, she's been locked up indoors most of her life and unable to explore the outdoors without the use of what's effectively a spacesuit. She was picked up by General Resource for research, and as part of testing, she was somehow found to be innately talented at flying planes through a Neurolink. This version of the Neurolink interface is called Connection for Flight Interface, or COFFIN for short, which is really, really cool. More recently, as an adult, she's joined UPEO. This sadly now puts her at odds with the General Resource she once called home, as eerily demonstrated in the next mission. Ravine flying missions are tense at the best of times, but now we have to follow another plane. And Rena isn't exactly making the best first impression. It seems she's been here before, in her latent memories, but she was with someone else, and it seems that this escapes her. For the duration of the mission, we can overhear her mumble to herself in second-hand audible flashbacks as she fails to cover our tale. There's a Silent Hill-esque fogged draw distance and a reflective water surface that visibly reflects your plane below you, since the coffin system allows you to see through the cabin floor. This heavy unease is heightened by the percussive tension in the electronic music. This mission is probably one of the best examples of how effectively the team achieves a mood by combining environmental design, tense gameplay scenario, music, serious and admirable voiceover work, and visual trickery. It's so naturally achieved it almost seems like it has to have been inspired by others' efforts. But there was nothing prior to inspire this. There was no game quite like Ace Combat. Even in its genre and among its copycats, there was no game aiming for any form of uncertain and haunting atmosphere, never mind a considered story to contextualize it. At a lack of any other excuse than pure luck, I can only blame this on developer brilliance. Since this place has a strong resonance with her, we can assume that we're helping to destroy somewhere that she once knew very well. There's 3 goal areas the plane you're tailing could arrive at, and it's different each time, so you do really need to follow it. If you end up at the wrong place, then we'll skip a couple missions that explore Rena's backstory, or you can choose to skip these missions with Rena on your own, and an entirely different filler mission plays out. Despite the lengths the game goes to have a holistic approach to its presentation, we're starting to see cutscenes that kind of break that immersion. To begin with, before that mission, we saw footage of 2 unidentified men seemingly infiltrating a NEUCOM hangar, and seeing that they're putting UPEO's names on their planes. Then the WASG set off an alarm. There's no context for why you would see this within the computer system. Nobody talks about it to you. And after that mission, we get footage of Rena whilst she was at the very development facility that we just destroyed. It features an image of Dision and a group of scientists on Toinka. It's filed with a date, so it's certainly given context within the Data Swallow system, but we really shouldn't have this data. Now, we could think about this incongruity, but we have a personal message from Rena inviting us out for a night on the town. Just us and her. In our planes, of course, looking for another plane called Night Raven. The mission may be called No Clearance, but I can think of a couple things I'd like to take off. Before we can make it out of the area, we're ordered to return at once. Like I said before, we get to choose to follow Rena's story here, quite literally. If we break off from the following mechanic, and leave it be, we can land back on the runway for an extra mission that's meaningless but fun. But, as for myself at least, I feel like pulling the flaps up and going full thrust at a tail, so we're gonna see this mission through, I think. Coincidentally, however, General Resource happened to be sending armed recon planes into the Truce territory, which pretty much blocks us from going further without intercepting. And what's worse, Dision is here and seems to recognize her voice as she complains on the radio. Rena and Dision exchange quite coded words. They appear familiar, but estranged. Their individual goals appear to be the same. They both have an affection for a plane called Night Raven, and want to find it. Nothing quite ruins a date like running into an ex, eh? Unfortunately, because of this surprise attack by General, we couldn't go all the way tonight, so we're just gonna have to touch down ourselves. Since we saved the day through coincidence, we're not going to be reprimanded, and Rena even took the precaution of deleting us from the mission data as a thanks for sticking by her side. Sadly, it's only her superiors who'll give her a good dressing down. As a side effect of introducing us to Rena, this has also increased our intrigue around Dision, given his ever-presence and relation to her. The next arc we have will be spurred on by our next mission, given to us by Commander Park. Fiona's transporting UPEO delegate Mr. Clarkson herself, and it's just us and Eric escorting. Even our squad are drawing attention to how light the support is during this mission. For some reason, General Resource planes start popping up to attack and jamming our comms. Why they're attacking UPEO's head directly when we're peacekeepers is a strange move, but what's more is that this transportation isn't public knowledge. The information got out. Somehow. It's only after we've cleaned up the airspace that Rena comes to rescue with a friendly fighter. But it doesn't seem like she's just fashionably late. We've got a mission update. Commander Park, who happens to share a history with the General, claims that the flight by Clarkson and Fiona is espionage, and we're ordered to shoot down the transport. With the jammed communications, we can't personally confirm this intel. Rena therefore prioritizes orders and leaves the execution of it to another plane. Eric begs her not to do this, and claims he needs to help Fee.
Decide.
The choice this time is presented as proper gameplay. We can either stop Rena's ally from shooting down Fiona and Clarkson's transport, or we can just watch and let it happen. Heaven forbid we do it ourselves. This is clearly nonsense by Park to get the pacifist leader of UPEO out of the way, and in order to see it through, We'll have to watch someone kill one of our own allies who hasn't misstepped us once through the storyline. The only consideration weighing against this decision is how down bad I am for Rena. The third and final leg of the UPEO storyline begins with us exchanging to Disc 2, and immediately you can see why. There's 4 fucking minutes of FMV cutscenes back to back, and there's even more audio logs. First from Park, who looks sinister as hell. The smug prick decides to cover up Clark's and Fiona's death as an accident and keep her betrayal a secret for her family's sake. It's not very convincing. A later cutscene looks into Park's new office, seemingly from the perspective of CCTV, and him enjoying his ill-gotten power, mocking the dead. He's talked down to by the CEO of General Resource, calling his actions rash, but Park has other ideas. In a few more missions, this very same CEO will have a fatal heart attack from a malfunctioning artificial heart that was networked into the Electrosphere. The game hints this is some form of sabotage, but I have to wonder if this was an ill-timed pericardial Windows update. Either way, the cover-up of Delegate Clarkson's death is working according to the news. Literal talking heads are theorizing what it means for the growing corporate tensions. The predictions leaning towards war, given Park is in charge. Eric calls us up after the broadcasts, like a drunk friend at 2 AM, questioning whose agenda we're under, only just now suspecting that the entire mission to kill Delegate Clarkson might have been planned by glorious leader Park. As he laments this, we get disconnected, and the conversation is deleted from our archive. But this conversation follows through to the start of the next mission.
ただ飛ぶため決まってるじゃない。
God, she's perfect. As if to frame that discussion, we get a mission where, despite the now seeming inevitability of the corporate warfare, the likes of which an international military cannot limit, it's buffered by 2.5 minutes of calm chasing as we try to fly higher and higher to some of the most soothing music in the game. Despite our obviously being too narrow-minded, the game wants us to focus on this feeling of almost impossible aspiration, like Rena. Eventually they drop out of the atmosphere and we skirmish above the snow. You don't know the ground from the clouds, adding to an ethereally floaty feeling through the stage and mission design alone. Rena claims as long as she can fly, she'll do anything, even killing her friends. And if Eric can't do the same, he should quit. Eric's anger grows until he realizes that Rena's crying under her comms. Something really isn't right with her. What she's saying is quite unhinged and doesn't seem to match up with her feelings. This will be important later. Eric tells us to relay to Rena that he doesn't blame her for what happened. War is war, after all, but UPEO is meant to be preventing that, which it clearly isn't anymore. After this, we've got a few filler missions that stagger the story beats out that we'll condense down. Dision gets in on a conference call and taunts the top brass at NEUCOM. He reminds them of their dark past as a former part of General Resource, claiming that that General Resource murdered him. The silent witness isn't so silent anymore. Next, though, we have a mission with a particularly interesting goal.
Eradicate virus.
NEUCOM have allowed their nanobites to run rampant out of the research lab. The clusters are localized for now, across a few kilometers. If we don't take action, this lab-created virus may spread across the world. I would say that this mission has a genius cost-saving design to it, because you actually can't physically see your enemy targets. They're microscopic machines after all. But despite this, your most direct routes between the clusters often go near these giant, kind of mushroom-shaped domes, subconsciously liking the nanomachines to spores. Over these, your screen starts darkening, saturating and artifacting, chipping away at the health of your plane and screeching virus alerts. That and the missiles that you fire have bespoke sound effects and blue visual flourish as they travel and explode. They really didn't skimp on this mission when they really could have. The nanobites themselves aren't able to be locked onto, so you have to manually aim and maybe take a couple clusters at once if you consider the blast radius. Despite the tension of the music and the areas of the map that screech death as your screen melts, it's quite a chill mission until Rena accidentally allows her plane to get too close to a dome and her plane gets infected.
Contamination level 30%. 40%. Warning. Cannot restore system. Cannot restore system.
Heart here is used in a poetic sense. The Japanese share the sentiment that true emotions reside in your heart. This is a life-threatening circumstance. There's no ejection here. We learn later the stakes that the little machines are going to take over her body and try to recreate her as a machine. She was kinda all for this transhumanist ideals thing in the opening, and that's understandable since sunlight will wipe out her existence, but I think she's somewhat changed her mind. You have to hit a plane with an anti-nanobite bomb without lock-on to save her. It's a bit of a chase, and these things aren't exactly well ranged since they're meant to be dropped, so you have to practically be melting your canopy with her afterburners to get a reliable shot, but it only takes one. Following the time-honored anime tradition, now that we've saved her life, we have unlocked the right to hear its story, or at the very least the most thematically poignant parts. Ironically enough, she dreamed of being a machine when she was young, because robotics seemed more promising than the fickle body that she was born with. We seem to have thwarted her chances, but she's thankful. Seems she was overfaced with the agony of her flesh being reconstituted. Her disease is a real one. In real life, this is called polymorphous light eruption, and sufferers wear things more like hazmat suits. The name change to Silverstone disease seems to be linking Rena to the moon, it being a large silver stone doomed to darkness. And instead, giving her a spacesuit to cope with the sunlight, they add a sci-fi otherworldliness to her illness. And you can imagine that, from the other children's perspective, she was an alien. But the recognizably terrestrial appearance of a little space helmet and how the other children in the foreground are discolored blue makes it seem like she's the only human in an unforgiving atmosphere. Additionally, it's never drawn direct attention to, but it's implied that she has no hair, be it a side effect of her illness or so they can monitor her brainwaves more closely. Either way, she hid this too from those around her, increasing the subconscious distance she seems to hold. In this way, Rena's quite real disease has been strongly fictionalized to lend more drama to her character. There were obvious negative psychological effects of this, which primed her for who would enter her life next, Abyssal Dision. They connected with one another. He was a very large influence on her life, introducing her to flight. There's a certain poeticism to Dishon's idea of helping her being to put her in a coffin. Some part of this fascination is that they never met face to face, only ever talking through computer screens. That removed much of the pretense that surrounded her life. The things that created distance between her and others didn't matter when she was talking to him, or when she was in the air. How she speaks about their relationship sounds very unhealthy. She talks about their hearts being connected and not caring what became of herself. It's a pretty intense dedication to someone she's only spoken to through a screen. She realizes this herself, only too late. It turns out he didn't care for her at all. The only thing he wanted was her body. It's not directly stated why he lost interest. Maybe she started growing hair. Whether it's a wig or not, it covers up the electroneuron synapse interface on the back of her neck, which is the implication for how the entire squad flies their planes and can see through their cockpit. She vowed never to relinquish the wings that she'd earned, and this informs her fight and flight attitude in previous missions that put her at odds with Eric. But not anymore. From this experience, she's learned to love the body that this world and Abyssal Lolicon rejected. She wants to live with it and grow her own metaphorical wings rather than rely on technology. Her story is ultimately one about the value of one's own humanity and the ability to find meaning in ourselves rather than in technology, in contrast to a world that's succumbing to that very technological advancement. Uzia is one incident away from all-out corporate war, and we're doing the menial task of suppressing an internal conflict at General, at least on the face of it. And we're testing out some new planes from NEUCOM while we're at it. They fly like a dream, and we're almost completely unchallenged, so this mission really feels like a breeze. We get to mount a 1.5-minute surprise attack thanks to some radio jamming. If you'll notice in the footage, and as Rena notes at the start of the mission, our planes have NEUCOM livery. The mission completes in relative silence, but a news report that follows tells a different story. Journos claim our actions resulted in civilian casualties despite us only aiming for things like ground radars. And not only that, the blame is being pinned on UCOM thanks to our unintended disguises. We were doing too good a job at abating conflict, and now we've been used to spur it into action. We were part of an inside job, a false flag. Our UPEO, the United Peace Enforcement Organization, has just ignited the corporate war. From this point on, the story devolves as the various tensions placed in the narrative are unfurled. Eric asks what the point of a peace organization is if all we do is kill people, and that is all we do. We're ushered into war zones to solve a problem which can only be inflated by our methods. Eric posits it's so Park can rule the world, which is more or less confirmed in an accompanying cutscene of Park talking to Abyssal Dision. Around the same time, the Electrosphere is running mundane weather forecasts, advertisements for space exploration, airports in disarray, and miniature news stories about ATMs failing. Furthermore, the Electrosphere is being flooded with interrupts, which even the news broadcasts say shouldn't be technically feasible. The structure of the internet isn't one where it's capable of requesting interrupts of other networked processes, at least not without horrendous exploits or a backdoor placed in the standards within which it operates. As it turns out, this is an intentional attack. We now have a fourth party in the works, OUROBOROS. They're an extremist group attempting to use the cover of war's political chaos to dismantle the physical undercurrents of the world. They dump their philosophy wholesale in an internet press release, which deconstructs the concept of a capitalist dystopia directly, hitting the heart and saying its national powers were superseded by financial interest, and that this itself is all spilled out from human greed. And they have a cunning diagnosis. The point where their criticism gains some originality is when they dedicate that this greed is innately human. This greed is all sourced from the human body. Our human flesh implores us to secure and accrue to subside its fragility, urges, and maintenance. The world doesn't revolve around money, it revolves around the human condition. A capital-driven society that descends into heartless practical war is inevitable to us, so their solution is surrender your physical form. Without the curse of flesh, as they call it, there won't be any need to reproduce, eat, sleep, or even breathe. There won't be a need for the corporations in this setting, or even nations, going back to a simpler time. The solution to the world is to let it burn down in the war our bodies have stirred up. And then, if avarice is human, they want to remove the human element. The solution to the body is to liberate us from them, to liberate us from mortality. In their terms, to sublimate humanity, digitize the life, mind, and consciousness, your soul, and upload yourself to the Electrosphere. And they already have an example, Abyssal Dision. Having lost his body with general resource, he is a consciousness within the Electrosphere. He was effectively a beta tester. But it's not like a Frenchman to be a revolutionary, is it? That's what he meant when he said that he was killed by them 20 years ago. It informs his attitude and acts to this point. It explains more clearly what Rena meant when she said that he wanted her body, and I guess I owe Abyssal Discord mod an apology. With the post hoc reasoning that peace is a bygone concept, we're being laid off by Commander Park. UPEO is being disbanded. Not much peace left to enforce in a full-blown war, I suppose. Then he slips in that we should join OUROBOROS, revealing that Dision was pulling his strings all along. Rena is aghast that it's Dision whom is at the center of all of this horror, the man who both gave and took her wings away. She decides she's taking the matter personally. Little does she know she was groomed from a young age for this very moment. She immediately jets it into OUROBOROS' flying airbase and montages her way up through the facility, asking herself what the digidestined villain Dision is up to. And he simply gives her the fabled Night Raven. It's a dual delta-winged, stingray-shaped jet. He's reinvigorated that old flame in the least comforting way, saying he's been watching her all along from within the Electrosphere. He dulcetly offers her the wings that will make her fulfill her dreams. Rena gets in the fucking Night Raven. There's a skirmish we're thrust into at this point in an attempt to save her from her rash actions, and it's a good time to reflect on something really quite dark we're witnessing. There's a bit of a heinous undertone to Dision's plot of child indoctrination exposed in Rena's language through the game. The material the writing team was inspired by was very likely a creative interpretation of the multi-angle persuasiveness with which extremists will indoctrinate younger members of society. That includes appeals to aspiration, which the culprit has either dug out of or embedded in their target. In this case, he implanted a sense of importance to do something greater, and deep personal connection with the consideration that they're of opposite sexes. As horrifying as that is, we can at least rest assured that Dision himself has no bodily urges of his own. But that doesn't mean he didn't tactically use this angle to groom the girl, based on the dedicated and romantic language of Rena's recollections. I don't actually want to put too fine a point on this. I don't think this inappropriate angle is a genuine part of Dision's desires, more just a tool. It's this emotional engineering, especially of a shut-in without much social experience, that lets an adult capture a young person's desires in order to control their opinions or actions as they get older. This is an overlap in both child exploitation and cult behavior. The creativity the writers used was how one would do it through a computer screen, and despite how foreign that idea was in the late 90s, it was treated with a very honest gravity that paints Rena as a victim. I can imagine that their research on this topic was as uncomfortable as mine was. There's a very fine line between indoctrination and grooming, and historically the former can become the latter, or vice versa. If this game had come out in the West undoctored, Rena and Dision's relationship would have sounded off-puttingly intimate, and likely have been censored by omission. With over 20 years retrospect, however, and more honest fan translations, Ace Combat 3 provides a disturbingly accurate premonition of how vulnerable youths are exploited in their naivete online. Dision is an inhuman monster, and the player's meager influence helped Rena see that. She boarded Night Raven and determines that she cannot forgive him. She strikes Dishon's ship directly, weakening it, but her plane self-detonates and plummets to the surface, likely a backup plan that went off a little too late. He too is falling from the sunset sky, and now he's stuck floating down. It's our chance to fight through the ranks and take him down. There's some flair here showing him shooting almost randomly to try and prevent us from getting anywhere in range, almost as if he's embodied the ship and is panicking physically. This makes there a golden range of attack that you have to consider, whilst finding ways of avoiding or nullifying his escorts. Eric asks to deliver the final blow for Rena's sake. There's one more nighttime mission left, to destroy our old workplace at UPEO, and hopefully Commander Park along with it. We're required to destroy the surface base and its protectorate planes, and finally to fly into the tunnel where Commander Park is attempting to escape by helicopter. The fool only gave us a heat signature to target. With Eric mulling how the wars left nothing of value in its wake, the world has been burnt to the ground. The scene transitions to the Midnight Shore waves and Night Raven's beached carcass. Rena disembarks from the belly of the beast, and for perhaps the first time, takes off her protective suit to smell the salty ocean air. Protected by the night sky, she pulls the interface from the back of her neck. She's surmounted her inner demon, she's found value in the body she was born with, and she isn't afraid of the real world anymore. The mission is fittingly called A Canopy of Stars. She sees the player and Eric fly past and smiles her first and only smile of the game. To use her words, her heart can fly on its own now. I'd like to say this is the story of one girl reclaiming her life from sickness and a world that only wanted to use her. But this was just ending C.
あなたはどこから来たの?
My research for this video likely put me on several government watch lists. How about you put me on yours? The next video in this series is not yet edited, and will therefore be a long, long while.